the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys that time seems to have abandoned, there exists a documented case that has puzzled historians for nearly 2 centuries. In 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a community so isolated that maps of the era barely acknowledged its existence. What happened during their 3-day stay was meticulously recorded in the personal journal of Pastor William Phillips, a document discovered in 1987 when the old church was finally demolished. The journal entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally accurate, that modern psychologists have studied them extensively. Yet none can explain how 2 young children could possess knowledge that defied every rational explanation. The Morrison twins didn't just predict future events. They revealed secrets buried for decades, described people they'd never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred years before their birth. But perhaps most unsettling of all, every single detail they revealed proved to be absolutely verifiably true. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Before we dive deeper into the Morrison case, make sure you're subscribed, because we're about to uncover details that most historians refuse to discuss. And tell us in the comments, what state are you listening from? Because what happened in Kentucky might have happened closer to your home than you think. The story begins not with the supernatural, but with something far more unsettling: the possibility that some human minds can access information in ways science still cannot comprehend. The Kentucky of 1834 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization, where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement had been established in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom away from the denominational conflicts plaguing larger towns. By the time the Morrison family arrived, Pine Hollow consisted of barely 200 souls, most related by blood or marriage, all bound by the strict Baptist doctrine that governed every aspect of their daily lives. The community centered around a modest wooden church, built with their own hands using timber from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, a learned man who had abandoned his comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and significant events. His meticulous nature would prove crucial in documenting what was about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar figure along the circuit of remote churches scattered throughout the Appalachian region, tall and weathered with prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships beyond his 34 years. He traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel containing his Bible, a few personal items, and the journal where he recorded his spiritual observations. He had been widowed for 9 years, ever since his wife Sarah died, giving birth to the twins during a terrible winter storm that had isolated their cabin for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were striking in their identical appearance, yet completely different in temperament. Rebecca, born first by mere minutes, possessed an outgoing nature that drew people to her immediately. Her smile was infectious, her laughter genuine, and she spoke with the confidence of someone far older. Rachel, quieter and more observant, seemed to exist in her sister's shadow. Yet those who looked closely noticed that she often began sentences that Rebecca would finish, or answered questions directed at her sister before Rebecca had a chance to respond. What made the Morrison family particularly noteworthy among the circuit preachers was Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling congregations. Stories followed them from church to church, tales of backsliders returning to faith, of communities resolving long-standing conflicts, of spiritual awakenings that lasted for years after their departure. Some attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate preaching, but those who observed more carefully noticed that the real changes often began after private conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow had been particularly difficult. Late autumn rains had turned the mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel had been forced to carry Rachel for the final 5 miles when she developed a fever. They arrived at sunset on the 15th of November, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was concluding evening prayers with the handful of congregants who attended weeknight services. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of profound weariness, not just physical, but spiritual. Ezekiel's clothes were traveled and patched, his boots worn thin from countless miles of mountain paths. The girls clung close to their father, Rachel still pale from her fever, Rebecca's usual brightness dimmed by exhaustion. Yet something in their eyes, an alertness, an awareness that seemed inappropriate for children their age, made Phillips feel inexplicably uneasy. The congregation of Pine Hollow had extended hospitality to many traveling preachers over the years. But there was something different about the Morrisons from the very beginning. That first evening, as the family shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically inquiring whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that nearly killed them 3 summers ago. Mrs. Phillips had dropped her spoon, staring at the child in amazement. The rose blight had indeed occurred 3 years prior, devastating her prized flower garden, but it was not something she had mentioned to anyone outside the immediate community. When pressed, Rebecca simply smiled and said she had dreamed about roses while walking, and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most beautiful ones in the county. This incident, recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal that very evening, would prove to be merely the first of many that would challenge everything the Pine Hollow community believed about the natural world. The next morning dawned grey and cold, with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the small cabin where the Morrison family had been given shelter. Pastor Phillips rose early, as was his custom, to prepare for the day's sermon. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his Bible open, but his eyes staring into the distance with an expression of deep concern. "The girls had disturbing dreams last night," Ezekiel explained when Phillips inquired about his troubled demeanor. "They often dream of the places we're going to visit, but these dreams were different, darker." Before Phillips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, but her eyes alert and focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "in your church, beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden." The pastor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had indeed hidden something beneath those exact floorboards, a bottle of whiskey that represented his ongoing struggle with temptation. Not a soul knew about it. He had placed it there during a moment of weakness 3 months prior, telling himself it was better to keep it close, where he could resist it daily, rather than to remove the temptation entirely. It was a secret that shamed him deeply. One he had confessed only to God in his private prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Phillips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel emerged from the shadows behind her sister, moving with that peculiar silent grace that seemed to characterize her every action. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket. A blue blanket." Phillips sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The cloth was indeed a remnant of a baby blanket, the blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failures, both as a father who couldn't save his child and as a pastor who couldn't conquer his own weaknesses. Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with an expression that mixed sympathy with a weary familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he explained quietly. "At first, I thought it was merely childish intuition, the way young ones sometimes sense things adults miss. But as they grew older, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain through natural means." That Sunday service would be remembered by every member of the Pine Hollow congregation for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel's sermon was powerful, but not unusual for a circuit preacher, a passionate call for spiritual renewal and confession of sins. It was what happened afterward that defied all rational explanation. As the congregation began to file out, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the church and his standing in the community. She looked up at him with her innocent blue eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives those who repent." The color drained from Turner's face. For 6 months, he had been skimming small amounts from the collection plate, to cover debts from a failed investment in a Louisville business venture. He had told himself he would replace every penny once his financial situation improved, but the missing money had been eating at his conscience like a cancer. Before Turner could respond, Rachel moved to stand beside her sister and addressed Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow who served as the church's unofficial moral authority. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere, and that's why you hide the letters." The elderly woman swayed as if she might faint. Her husband had indeed abandoned her and their children 15 years earlier, taking their savings and disappearing one night without explanation. She had fabricated the story of his accidental death to preserve her dignity and her children's future in the community. The letters Rachel mentioned were the occasional correspondence she received from him pleading for forgiveness and describing his new life in Missouri. She had never spoken of them to anyone. One by one, the twins moved through the congregation, speaking quietly to various members. To Dr. Hayes, they mentioned patients who had died under his care due to his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they spoke knowingly of the son they kept hidden in their attic, a young man whose simple mind made them ashamed before their neighbors. To young Thomas Brett, they described in detail his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband traveled frequently on business. Each revelation was delivered with childlike innocence, without judgment or malice, as if the girls were simply sharing observations about the weather. Yet the accuracy of their statements was so precise, so impossible, that the congregation stood frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community was turned inside out by two 9-year-old children who spoke of secrets that should have been known only to God. But it was Rebecca's final statement that would haunt him for the rest of his days. She walked to the front of the church, stood before the altar, and placed her small hand on the wooden cross that had been carved by the church's founding members. "This is sacred ground," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent sanctuary, "but it's been stained by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here in this very room, and some of you know exactly why." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was waiting for someone to respond to this impossible accusation. The revelation about the Whitman family struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, his face pale as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's deepest secret, a wound that had never properly healed despite 16 years of collective silence. N1818. When Pine Hollow was still a struggling settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most prominent members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and unofficial leader, while his wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle way with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been the community's darlings, bright, beautiful 9-year-old girls who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend to the sick. The official story, the one recorded in Pastor Phillips's predecessors' carefully maintained records, stated that the Whitman family had perished in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies had been found in their homes' remains, and they were buried in the church cemetery with appropriate ceremony. The community mourned, rebuilt, and moved forward as frontier communities were forced to do when tragedy struck. But Rebecca's statement suggested a far different reality, one that several of the older congregation members had hoped would remain buried forever. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one of Pine Hollow's founding families, slowly rose from his pew. His arthritis made movement painful, but his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally spoke. "Child," he said, his words measured and careful, "you speak of things that happened before you were born in places you've never been. How could you possibly know about what you claim to know?" Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes holding an unsettling maturity. "Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder," she said quietly. "Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her nightgown because she had been ill with fever." These details, impossible for a stranger to know, sent a murmur of recognition through the older members of the congregation. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. "The night they died," Rachel continued, her voice soft but clear, "it wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came to the church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar, but they were found anyway." The church had grown so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Pastor Phillips found himself remembering fragments of conversations he had heard over the years. Whispered words that stopped when he entered a room, meaningful glances between the older members when certain topics arose, the way some families always left flowers at an unmarked spot in the cemetery. Samuel Turner, still shaken by the earlier revelation about his financial transgressions, stood up abruptly. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are speaking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." But even as he spoke, other details began emerging from the congregation. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, whispered something about bloodstains that had appeared on the church floor years later, stains that couldn't be cleaned, no matter how hard they scrubbed. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned the strange sounds that sometimes echoed from the church late at night, sounds like children crying that had been dismissed as wind through the loose boards. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier embarrassment about his medical qualifications, found himself speaking up with clinical precision. "I've always wondered about the church's foundation," he said slowly. "When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like, well, what could have been bone fragments mixed with the original mortar." The implications of his statement hung heavy in the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died in the church, if their bodies had been secretly interred within its very foundations, then every service, every prayer, every moment of worship had taken place over their unmarked graves. Ezekiel Morrison had been standing silently throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern, but no surprise. He had witnessed similar scenes in other communities, watched as his daughter's impossible knowledge unraveled, carefully maintained lies, and brought long-buried truths into the light. "Mr. Morrison," Pastor Philip said, his voice strained, "how do your daughters know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation before responding. "I've asked myself that question every day for years," he finally said. "Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experience goes far beyond anything Sarah ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people they've never met, know details about events that occurred before their birth." He paused, looking at his daughters with a mixture of love and profound sadness. "At first, I believed it was a blessing, a divine gift that would help me minister to troubled souls. But over the years, I've begun to wonder if it's something else entirely. The knowledge they possess, it comes with a cost. They carry the weight of everyone's secrets, everyone's pain. They know things children should never have to know." As if summoned by their father's words, the twins moved to stand together at the front of the church. For the first time since their arrival, they looked truly like the children. They were small, vulnerable, and overwhelmed by the adult world swirling around them. "We don't choose what we see," Rebecca said, her earlier confidence replaced by a weariness that seemed far too old for her young face. "The dreams come whether we want them or not. We see what was, what is, and sometimes what will be." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "The Whitman sisters visit our dreams sometimes. They want people to know what really happened to them. They want someone to remember them properly." The church fell silent again, but this time it was the silence of people grappling with concepts that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Some faces showed skepticism, others fear, and still others adorning hope that perhaps death was not the final ending they had always believed it to be. Pastor Phillips found himself at a crossroads that would define the rest of his ministry. He could dismiss the twins' claims as childish fantasy or deliberate deception, preserving the community's carefully maintained stability. Or he could pursue the truth, no matter where it led, and risk destroying the foundations upon which Pine Hollow had been built. The decision would prove to have consequences that none of them could have anticipated. That evening, as shadows lengthened across Pine Hollow's narrow streets, Pastor Phillips found himself unable to concentrate on his usual evening prayers. The twins' revelations had shaken him to his core, not just because of their accuracy, but because they had forced him to confront questions he had been avoiding for years. He had arrived at Pine Hollow 5 years earlier, eager to serve God in the wilderness and to escape the theological controversies that plagued the more established churches in Kentucky's larger towns. His predecessor, Pastor Morai Hayes, had left behind meticulous records of births, deaths, and significant events, but Phillips had always noticed gaps in the documentation from the settlement's earliest years. The winter of 1818 in particular seemed oddly sparse in recorded details. There were entries about harsh weather, supply shortages, and the deaths of several elderly residents. But the Whitman family's tragedy was mentioned only briefly. Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, and their twin daughters Hope and Faith perished in a house fire on the night of the 21st of December. Their earthly remains were committed to the ground with appropriate Christian ceremony. What had always struck Phillips as strange was the lack of detail about such a significant event. Pastor Hayes had been thorough in his documentation of even minor incidents. Yet the death of an entire family, particularly one as prominent as the Whitmans, had been recorded with unusual brevity. Determined to understand what the Morrison twins might have uncovered, Phillips began searching through the church's stored records with new eyes, hidden beneath years of accumulated documents. He discovered a small leather journal he had never seen before. The pages were water-stained and fragile, but the handwriting was clearly Pastor Hayes's own. What Phillips read by candlelight that night would change his understanding of Pine Hollow's history forever. The journal revealed that Pastor Hayes had been deeply troubled by the circumstances surrounding the Whitman family's death. According to his private notes, Jacob Whitman had discovered something disturbing about certain members of the community, something significant enough that he had demanded a public confession and reparation. The nature of the discovery wasn't clearly stated, but Hayes's entries suggested it involved financial impropria and possibly worse. On the night of the 20th of December, 1818, Jacob Whitman had apparently confronted several community leaders in a heated meeting that lasted until well after midnight. Hayes wrote of raised voices, accusations of theft and corruption, and threats of exposure that would destroy the reputations of some of Pine Hollow's most respected families. The final entry, dated the 22nd of December, was particularly chilling. "The Lord forgive us all for what was done." Jacob and his family came to the church, seeking sanctuary, but they were followed. I heard the children crying, then silence. When morning came, we found them as they had been left. Elder Thompson and the others insisted we must protect the community's future, that the truth would destroy us all. I have agreed to their plan. May God have mercy on my soul. Phillips set down the journal with trembling hands. The implications were staggering. The Whitman family hadn't died in a house fire at all. They had been murdered in the church itself, and the community's leaders had conspired to cover up the crime. But how could the Morrison twins possibly know details that had been hidden for 16 years? How could they describe the children's clothing, their personal belongings, their physical characteristics with such precision? His contemplation was interrupted by a soft knock at his door. Opening it, he found Rebecca standing in the moonlight, still wearing her simple dress, but with her hair neatly braided, as if she had been awake and preparing for something important. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice. "You found Pastor Hayes's journal, didn't you? The one he hid behind the loose stone in the foundation." Phillips stared at her in amazement. He had indeed found the journal in exactly that location, guided by a subtle draft that had led him to discover the loose stone. "How did you know where to tell me to look?" he asked. "Faith showed me in a dream," Rebecca replied. Matter-of-factly. She said, "Pastor Hayes was a good man who was forced to do bad things. She wanted someone to know the truth. The casual way." She spoke of receiving guidance from a long D-Dad child sent chills down Phillips' spine. "Rebecca," he said carefully, "what exactly do you see when you have these dreams?" The child's expression grew serious, and for a moment, Phillips could see the burden she carried. "We see everything," she said simply. "Not just what happened, but why it happened. The men who killed the Whitman family didn't plan to hurt anyone. They just wanted Jacob to stay quiet about what he'd discovered." What had he discovered? Rebecca looked past him into the cabin where he could see Rachel sitting by the window staring out at the church cemetery. The money for the church building didn't come from donations. She said some of it was stolen from travelers passing through the valley. Jacob found out about it when he was asked to make horseshoes for horses that belonged to dead men. The pieces began falling into place in Philip's mind. The early years of Pine Hollow had been marked by frequent reports of travelers disappearing along the mountain paths. Officially, these disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers, bears, falls, exposure to harsh weather. But if Jacob Whitman had discovered evidence that some travelers had been deliberately murdered and robbed, the church was built with blood money, Rebecca continued, her young voice carrying a weight of understanding that should have been impossible at her age. That's why faith and hope can't rest. Their blood was spilled on ground that was already cursed. Phillips found himself face to face with a truth more horrible than anything he had imagined, the church he had devoted himself to serving. The sanctuary where he had prayed for guidance and comfort had been constructed with the proceeds of murder and had itself become the site of even greater violence. But even as he grappled with these revelations, a part of his mind remained analytical, questioning how could he verify any of this? How could he distinguish between supernatural knowledge and an elaborate deception? The answer would come sooner than he expected, and from a source that would challenge every rational explanation he might have constructed. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to Pine Hollow. As the Morrison family prepared for their departure, their planned 3-day stay having already been extended to accommodate Sunday's dramatic revelations, a lone horseman approached the settlement from the Eastern Trail. The rider was a man in his 52nd, well-dressed in the manner of townfolk, with a bearing that suggested education and authority. He introduced himself to Pastor Phillips as Thomas Brennan, a solicitor from Lexington who had been searching for information about events in Pine Hollow dating back to its founding years. "I represent the estate of one Marcus Webb," Brennan explained as he accepted Phillips's hospitality. "Mr. Webb died recently in Louisville, and among his effects, we found documents suggesting he had business dealings with this community in its early years. I'm attempting to trace the disposition of certain funds that may have been irregularly transferred." Phillips felt his blood chill. Marcus Webb was a name that had appeared in Pastor Hayes's secret journal, one of several travelers who had disappeared along the mountain paths in 1818 and 1819. According to Hayes's notes, Webb had been carrying a considerable sum of money intended for land purchases in Tennessee. Before Phillips could formulate a response, Rebecca appeared at his elbow with that uncanny timing that characterized so many of her appearances. She looked up at Brennan with curious eyes and said, "Mr. Webb had a gold watch with his initials engraved inside the cover. It had a crack across the crystal because he dropped it when he fell from his horse." Brennan's composure cracked visibly. "How could you possibly know about Marcus Webb's watch?" he demanded. That detail was mentioned only in his personal correspondence with his brother. Rachel materialized beside her sister, as if summoned by some invisible signal. "The watch is buried behind the church," she said quietly. "Along with his money bag and his horse's bridle, Elder Thompson put them there after what happened on the trail." The implications struck Phillips like a physical blow. If the twins were correct, if Marcus Webb's personal effects were indeed buried behind the church, it would prove that their knowledge extended far beyond what any normal child could possess. More importantly, it would provide tangible evidence of the crimes that had funded Pine Hollow's early development. Brennan dismounted his horse with urgent purpose. "I demand that we excavate the area immediately," he declared. "If what these children claim is true, we're looking at evidence of robbery and murder." Elder Thompson, who had been observing the exchange from a distance, approached with obvious reluctance. At 73, he was the only surviving member of the original leadership council that had made the decisions in those early years. His weathered face showed a mixture of resignation and defiance. "You speak of things you don't understand, stranger," Thompson said, his voice carrying the authority of age and position. "This community was built by God-fearing people who did what they had to do to survive in the wilderness." "Survival doesn't justify murder," Brennan replied sharply. "If these allegations are true, this entire settlement was founded on criminal acts." Rebecca looked up at Elder Thompson with those unsettling blue eyes that seemed to see far too much. "Mr. Thompson," she said gently, The nightmares stopped coming after the first year, didn't they? You told yourself that meant God had forgiven you. Thompson's facade crumbled visibly. "Child," he whispered, "you couldn't know about. No one knows about. About the dreams where Marcus Webb begged you to let him go." Rachel continued, her soft voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "About how you see his face every night before you fall asleep." The old man sank onto a nearby tree stump, as if his legs could no longer support him. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he said, his voice breaking. "We only meant to take the money. We were starving. Our children were sick, and winter was coming." But Webb fought back. And then his confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pea. Pastor Phillips realized he was witnessing the unraveling of everything he had believed about his community, his church, and his faith. Ezekiel Morrison, who had been standing silently through these revelations, finally spoke. "The truth has a way of surfacing," he said quietly. "My daughters don't choose what they reveal. They're simply conduits for information that demands to be heard." Brennan wasted no time in organizing an excavation party. Within hours, several men from the community were digging behind the church, guided by the twins' precise directions. Pastor Phillips watched with growing dread, knowing that each shovel full of earth brought them closer to evidence that would destroy Pine Hollow's carefully constructed mythology. They didn't have to dig deep. 3 foot below the surface, their shovels struck something metallic. Carefully brushing away the soil, they uncovered a tarnished gold pocket watch. Its crystal indeed cracked as Rebecca had described. The initials MW were clearly visible inside the cover. Beside the watch lay a leather money bag, its contents long since deteriorated, but its presence undeniable. The horse's bridle, though rotted by years of burial, was still recognizable for what it had been. Brennan examined each item with the methodical precision of a man accustomed to building legal cases. "This watch matches the description in Marcus Webb's correspondence exactly," he announced. "The crack across the crystal, the engraving, even the unusual chain link, everything is precisely as his brother described it." But it was Elder Thompson's reaction that provided the most damning confirmation. The old man stared at the recovered items with the expression of someone seeing ghosts, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or confession. "There were others," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "Webb wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last. The trail through these mountains was perfect for what we needed to do. Travelers came through regularly, usually alone, often carrying money for land deals or business ventures." The scope of the crimes was becoming clear. Pine Hollow hadn't been built through hard work and divine providence. It had been financed through a systematic campaign of robbery and murder that had lasted for years. But even as the evidence mounted, Phillips found himself grappling with questions that transcended the immediate crimes. How could the Morrison twins know details that no living person should possess? How could they describe victims they had never met? Crimes that had occurred before their birth, locations of evidence that had been hidden for decades. The answers would prove more disturbing than any rational explanation he might have constructed, and they would force him to confront the possibility that death was not the ending he had always believed it to be. As the sun set over Pine Hollow that evening, casting long shadows across the excavation site and the church cemetery beyond, Phillips realized that his community stood at a crossroads. The truth was finally emerging after 16 years of careful concealment. But with it came questions that challenged everything they had been taught to believe about justice, redemption, and the nature of reality itself. The Morrison twins stood together in the growing darkness, their small figures silhouetted against the church that had been built with blood money and consecrated with innocent blood. They seemed to be listening to something only they could hear. Their faces turned toward the cemetery where so many secrets lay buried beneath unmarked graves. Tomorrow would bring reckoning, but tonight belonged to the dead, who had finally found their voices through 2 9-year-old children who possessed knowledge that defied every rational explanation. Dawn broke gray and cold over Pine Hollow, bringing with it a delegation of officials from the county seat. Word of the previous days, discoveries had traveled fast, and Solicitor Brennan had wasted no time in contacting the authorities. By mid-morning, the small settlement found itself host to a county sheriff, a territorial judge, and 2 federal marshals who had been investigating the disappearances of travelers along the mountain trails for years. Judge Harrison, a stern man with silver hair and piercing grey eyes, had established his temporary court in the church itself, a choice that struck Pastor Phillips as grimly appropriate given the building's blood-soaked history. The entire community had been summoned to attend what would amount to both hearing and reckoning. Elder Thompson, his health visibly deteriorating under the weight of his confessions, sat in the front pew, flanked by two other elderly men who had been part of the original leadership council. Their faces bore the hollow look of men who had carried terrible secrets for too long. But it was the Morrison twins who commanded the most attention. Judge Harrison had initially been skeptical of claims that two children possessed supernatural knowledge, but the previous day's discoveries had forced him to reconsider. He had spent the morning interviewing them separately, trying to determine how they could possibly know details about crimes that predated their births. "Rebecca Morrison," Judge Harrison said, his voice echoing in the wooden church. "Please tell this court exactly how you know the location of Marcus Webb's personal effects." Rebecca stood in the witness area looking impossibly small beneath the weight of adult attention. "Faith Whitman told me in a dream," she said simply. "She said the men who killed her family were the same ones who killed the travelers. She wanted everyone to know the truth. And you, Rachel Morrison?" The judge continued. "How do you know details about events that occurred years before your birth?" Rachel's voice was barely audible as she responded. "The dreams come to both of us. We see what happened as if we were there. We see the fear in people's eyes. We hear their last words. We feel their pain." Judge Harrison leaned forward in his chair. "Are you claiming to communicate with the spirits of the dead?" Ezekiel Morrison rose from his seat. "Your Honor, if I may, my daughters have never claimed to understand their abilities. They simply report what they experience. I've witnessed them provide accurate information about dozens of communities we've visited, information they couldn't possibly have obtained through normal means." Sheriff Mackenzie, a practical man more concerned with evidence than supernatural claims, addressed the twins directly. "Can you tell us how many people were killed along these mountain trails?" Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Rebecca answered. 11 men over 3 years. Most were traveling alone with money for land purchases or business ventures. One was a preacher like Papa, but he carried gold coins sewn into his saddle. The specificity of their answer sent murmurs through the assembled crowd. Rachel continued where her sister left off, their tag team delivery as unsettling as always. The preacher's name was Samuel Collins. He was going to establish a new church in Tennessee. His horse was a bay mare with a white star on her forehead. Sheriff Mackenzie consulted a worn notebook he had pulled from his coat. His face grew pale as he found the entry he was looking for. "Samuel Collins disappeared along this route in September of 1819, he confirmed. "The description of his horse matches our records exactly, but it was what happened next that would shake everyone present to their very core." Elder Thompson, his hands trembling with age and guilt, struggled to his feet. "Your Honor," he said, his voice cracking, "I can bear this burden no longer. What these children say is true, every word of it. But there's something else, something worse than the murders we committed." The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. "The Whitman family," Thompson continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "They didn't just stumble upon evidence of our crimes. Jacob Whitman was my brother-in-law. I confided in him about what we were doing, thinking family loyalty would keep him quiet. But Jacob had a conscience stronger than his loyalty." Pastor Phillips felt the world tilting around him as Thompson's confession unfolded. "Jacob threatened to expose us all unless we made restitution to the families of the dead. He said he would ride to Lexington himself and report our crimes to the territorial authorities. We couldn't let that happen. Too many families depended on what we had built here." Thompson's voice dropped to a whisper. "On the night of the 21st of December, 1818, we followed the Whitman family to the church. Jacob had brought Mary and the twins here, thinking sacred ground would protect them. But we were desperate men with everything to lose." Rebecca had grown very still during Thompson's confession, her young face pale but determined. "Tell them about the babies," she said quietly. Thompson's composure cracked completely. "Dear God," he sobbed. "How could you know about the babies?" Judge Harrison leaned forward intently. "What babies? Explain yourself, man." Mary Whitman was with child when we killed her, Thompson said, the words seeming to tear from his throat. 8 months along with twins. The doctor said they might have lived if we had gotten help instead of... He couldn't finish the sentence. Rachel stepped forward, her soft voice carrying clearly through the stunned silence. That's why we can see everything so clearly. Faith and Hope Whitman weren't the only children who died that night. Their unborn sisters died with them, 4 souls crying out for justice. The theological implications of Rachel's statement sent shockwaves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were somehow channeling the spirits of the dead Whitman children, including the unborn, it suggested an understanding of the afterlife that challenged fundamental Christian doctrine. Of Dr. Hayes, the community's unofficial physician, found his voice. I assisted with the burial, he said slowly. We found evidence of the pregnancy, but we told ourselves the babies had been too young to have souls, that they wouldn't need proper burial rites. Every soul matters to God, Ezekiel Morrison said firmly. Every life, no matter how brief, has eternal significance. But Judge Harrison was more concerned with earthly justice than theological debate. Mr. Thompson, are you confessing to the murder of Jacob Whitman, his wife Mary, their twin daughters, and 2 unborn children? I am, Thompson replied, his voice hollow with despair. And to the murders of 11 travelers who trusted us with their lives. We are all guilty, myself, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry. We planned it together, we carried it out together, and we've hidden it together for 16 years. The 2 other elderly men named in Thompson's confession sat in stunned silence, their faces masks of resignation and terror. The weight of 16 years of collective guilt had finally become too heavy to bear. Sheriff Mackenzie stood and began placing the 3 men under arrest, but Judge Harrison raised a hand to stop him. Before we proceed with formal charges, the judge said, I need to understand how these children could possibly know details that were never recorded, never spoken of, never shared outside the circle of perpetrators. Rebecca looked up at the judge with those unnaturally knowing blue eyes. Your Honor, she said in her clear, childish voice, some truths are too big to stay buried forever. The Whitman sisters and their unborn babies have been waiting 16 years for someone to hear their story. But how do you hear them? Judge Harrison pressed. What mechanism allows this communication? Rachel joined her sister at the front of the church. We don't understand it any more than you do, she said, honestly. Ever since we were very small, we've had dreams about places we've never been and people we've never met. Papa says our mama had the gift of second sight, but what we experience is different. Different? How? Rebecca and Rachel exchanged one of their meaningful glances before Rebecca answered. Mama could sense things about living people, their emotions, their intentions, their hidden thoughts. But we see beyond that. We see the echoes that tragedy leaves behind, especially when innocent blood is spilled. Ezekiel Morrison had been listening to his daughters with growing concern. Your Honor, he said, I've spent years trying to understand my daughter's abilities. I've consulted with ministers, doctors, and scholars throughout Kentucky and Tennessee. None can explain it, but all have witnessed its accuracy. Judge Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the twins with a mixture of fascination and unease. Miss Rebecca, Miss Rachel, he said finally, if you truly possess this gift, then perhaps you can tell us where the bodies of the other victims were disposed of. The question hung in the air like incense smoke, heavy with implication. If the twins could locate the remains of Marcus Webb and the other murdered travelers, it would provide the final proof needed to close cases that had baffled authorities for years. Rebecca closed her eyes as if listening to something only she could hear. Some are in the old mine shaft east of town, she said after a moment. Others were thrown into Devil's Creek, where the current runs deepest, but 3 were buried beneath the church floor, their bones mixed with the foundation stones. The revelation that 3 murder victims had been interred beneath the church itself sent a collective shudder through the congregation. Pastor Phillips realized with horror that he had been conducting services, celebrating communion, and offering prayers for salvation while standing directly over the unmarked graves of innocent men. Sheriff Mackenzie looked to Judge Harrison for direction. Your Honor, if we're to verify these claims, we'll need to excavate the church floor itself. And we will, Judge Harrison replied grimly. But first, I want to understand the full scope of these crimes. He turned back to Elder Thompson. Where is the money stolen from these victims? What was done with their possessions? Thompson gestured weakly toward the church building around them. Everything went into building our community. The church, the school, the mills, all of it was built with blood money. We told ourselves we were creating something good from something evil, that God would forgive us if we used the money for righteous purposes. And the victims' families, Judge Harrison asked, did any of you consider the wives, children, parents who never learned what happened to their loved ones? It was Rachel who answered, her young voice carrying a weight of sadness that seemed inappropriate for her age. Marcus Webb had a wife named Elizabeth and 2 young sons. Samuel Collins was engaged to be married to a woman named Catherine, who waited for him until she died of consumption 3 years later. Most of the others had families who spent years wondering, hoping, grieving without closure. The specificity of her knowledge about the victims' personal lives was perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire ordeal. These weren't just names and dates. The twins spoke of the murdered men as if they had known them personally, as if they carried the weight of their unfulfilled dreams and abandoned responsibilities. Judge Harrison stood and addressed the assembled crowd. This court will recess while we conduct a thorough investigation of the claims made here today. Sheriff Mackenzie will coordinate the excavation of the church floor and the search of the locations identified by the Morrison children. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will remain in custody pending formal charges. As the 3 elderly men were led away in shackles, the congregation began to disperse in stunned silence. 16 years of carefully maintained lies had crumbled in a single morning, leaving a community to grapple with the knowledge that their entire foundation was built on murder and deceit. But for Pastor Phillips, the most disturbing questions remained unanswered. How could 2 9-year-old children possess knowledge that defied every natural law? What did their abilities suggest about the nature of death, the persistence of consciousness, and the possibility of communication between the living and the dead? The Morrison twins stood together in the emptying church, their small figures dwarfed by the magnitude of what they had revealed. They seemed tired, drained by the emotional weight of channeling so much pain and injustice. "Papa," Rebecca said quietly, "can we leave now? The voices are getting louder, and it's hard to keep them all straight." Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughters close, his weathered face showing deep concern for the burden they carried. "Soon," he promised. "But first, we need to help these people understand what you've shown them." As the sun reached its zenith over Pine Hollow, casting sharp shadows across the church cemetery and the excavation site behind the building, the community prepared for revelations that would challenge everything they thought they knew about: justice, redemption, and the eternal consequences of earthly actions. The truth was finally emerging from 16 years of darkness, but with it came questions that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The excavation of Pine Hollow's church floor took 3 days. Working methodically under Judge Harrison's supervision, Sheriff Mackenzie's team removed the wooden planks and began carefully digging through the packed earth beneath. What they found confirmed the Morrison twins' claims with chilling accuracy. 3 complete skeletons lay buried beneath the sanctuary. Their bones indeed mixed with the foundation stones, as Rebecca had described. Personal effects found with the remains matched descriptions from missing person reports dating back to 1818 and 1819. A gold ring bearing the initials JP belonged to Joshua Patterson, a land surveyor who had disappeared while mapping territorial boundaries. A silver-handled knife was identified as belonging to William Morse, a merchant whose family had searched for him across 3 states, but it was the 3rd set of remains that provided the most disturbing confirmation of the twins. Impossible knowledge. Wrapped around the skeleton's neck was a distinctive copper cross that had been described in great detail by the family of Robert Chen, a traveling minister who had vanished while carrying donation money for a new church in Tennessee, as each piece of evidence was carefully catalogued. The scope of Pine Hollow's crimes became undeniably clear. This had not been a single act of desperate violence, but a calculated campaign of murder and robbery that had lasted for years. Judge Harrison, his silver hair seeming to have gained more gray during the investigation, addressed the reassembled community on the 4th day. "The evidence before this court is overwhelming," he announced. 11 men were murdered along these mountain trails between 1818 and 820. Their killers used the stolen money to build this settlement, then compounded their crimes by murdering the Whitman family to protect their secret. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry stood before the judge in shackles, their faces showing the hollow exhaustion of men who had carried unbearable guilt for too long. At their advanced ages, they knew they would never live to see freedom again. The most disturbing aspect of these crimes, Judge Harrison continued, is not their brutality, but their calculated nature. These men didn't kill in passion or desperation. They created a systematic method for identifying and murdering travelers, then used their victims' money to build what they presented as a godly community. Pastor Phillips listened to the judge's words with a growing sense of spiritual crisis. Everything he had devoted himself to serving the church, the community, the shared faith that bound them together, had been built on a foundation of innocent blood. How could he continue to minister in a place so thoroughly corrupted by evil? But it was the Morrison twins who provided the most profound insight into the spiritual implications of Pine Hollow's crimes. "Judge Harrison," Rebecca said, her clear voice carrying easily through the packed church, "may we speak about forgiveness?" The judge looked down at the 9-year-old girl with a mixture of amazement and respect. After 3 days of witnessing, her impossible knowledge proved accurate in every detail. He had learned to listen carefully to anything she said. "Of course, child, what would you like to say?" Rebecca and Rachel moved to stand together at the front of the church beneath the wooden cross that had presided over 16 years of collective deception. "The Whitman sisters want everyone to know that they forgive the men who killed them." Rebecca said they understand that fear makes people do terrible things. Rachel continued the thought as she so often did, but forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. The men who committed these crimes must face earthly justice, and the community must find a way to make things right with the families of the victims. Judge Harrison nodded solemnly. "The court agrees with that assessment. Elder Thompson, Samuel Bradford, and Marcus Perry will face trial for multiple counts of murder and robbery. But what of the community itself? What of the church and buildings constructed with stolen money?" It was Ezekiel Morrison who answered, his weathered face reflecting deep thought. "Your Honor, in Scripture we find that the sins of the fathers need not be visited upon the children. If the children choose righteousness over convenience, this community can be redeemed, but only through confession, restitution, and genuine repentance." Pastor Phillips found his voice for the first time since the investigation began. "The church building itself must be consecrated anew," he said firmly. "We'll remove and properly bury the remains found beneath the floor. We'll identify and compensate the victims' families to the extent possible, and we'll establish a memorial to ensure these crimes are never forgotten." Solicitor Brennan, who had been documenting everything for his legal records, looked up from his notes. "The Marcus Webb estate alone is entitled to significant restitution. His brother has authorized me to pursue full recovery of the stolen funds, plus damages for 16 years of family anguish." Elder Thompson, despite his shackles and failing health, managed to speak. "The money is gone," he said quietly, "spent over the years on community improvements, individual family needs, church maintenance. We have nothing left to give. Then the community itself bears responsibility." Judge Harrison declared the buildings constructed with stolen money will be sold. The proceeds distributed to victims' families as partial restitution. Pine Hollow will effectively cease to exist as a settlement. The implications of the judge's decision struck the assembled crowd like a physical blow. Families who had spent 16 years building lives in Pine Hollow would lose their homes, their church, their entire community structure. Children would be uprooted, elderly residents displaced, a generation of stability destroyed by the crimes of their leaders. But it was Rebecca Morrison who provided the most chilling final revelation. "Judge Harrison," she said, her young voice carrying an authority that seemed impossible at her age, "there's something else you need to know about Pine Hollow. The crimes didn't stop in 1820. The church fell silent, except for the sound of wind through the loose boards and the distant thunder of an approaching storm." "What do you mean, child?" Judge Harrison asked, though his tone suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Rachel stepped forward to stand beside her sister, the mine shaft where some of the bodies were thrown. "It's not just a place where old crimes were hidden. People are still disappearing along these mountain trails." Sheriff Mackenzie straightened in his chair. "Are you saying these murders have continued?" "Not the same people," Rebecca clarified. Most of the original killers are too old now, but others learned from their example, the techniques, the locations, the methods of disposing of evidence. Knowledge like that doesn't die with its creators. The implications of her statement sent shock waves through the assembled crowd. If the twins were correct, Pine Hollow's crimes had spawned a tradition of violence that had persisted for decades, claiming additional victims whose disappearances had been attributed to natural dangers. Judge Harrison rose from his chair, his face grim with determination. "Sheriff Mackenzie, we'll need to expand our investigation immediately. If there are more recent crimes connected to this location, we must uncover them all." As the legal proceedings continued around them, the Morrison twins stood quietly together, their impossible burden finally lifted after 3 days of revelation and testimony. They had served as voices for the dead, conduits for justice denied, instruments of truth that could no longer be suppressed. Ezekiel Morrison gathered his daughter's clothes, his weathered face showing deep relief mixed with concern for what lay ahead. "Are you ready to leave this place?" he asked gently. Rebecca looked around the church one final time, her blue eyes taking in the wooden walls, the simple cross, the faces of people whose lives had been forever changed by her testimony. "The voices are quieter now," she said softly. "Faith and hope can rest." Rachel nodded, her hand finding her sister's. "But there will be other places, other voices. Papa, why do we have to carry all this sadness?" Ezekiel knelt down to his daughter's level, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't know, little ones, but I believe God gives special burdens only to those strong enough to bear them. Perhaps your gift, whatever it is, serves a purpose larger than any of us can understand." As the Morrison family prepared to leave Pine Hollow, taking their mysterious abilities and terrible knowledge with them, Pastor Phillips found himself facing the most difficult decision of his ministry. Should he stay and help rebuild what could be salvaged from the community's ruins, or should he flee from a place so thoroughly tainted by violence and deception? The answer came as he watched the twins walking hand in hand toward their father's side. If 2 9-year-old children could bear the weight of such devastating truth with grace and forgiveness, perhaps there was hope for redemption, even in the darkest places. 3 weeks later, Pine Hollow was a ghost town. The church building had been dismantled board by board, its materials sold to help compensate victims' families. The community's residents had scattered to other settlements across Kentucky and Tennessee, carrying with them the knowledge that their entire foundation had been built on innocent blood. But in churches across the region, a new story began to spread. The story of 2 young girls who possessed knowledge that defied rational explanation, who served as voices for the dead and instruments of long-delayed justice. Some dismissed the tale as frontier superstition. Others embraced it as evidence of divine intervention in human affairs. The Morrison family continued their circuit through the remote churches of Appalachia, and reports continued to follow them. Communities experiencing spiritual renewal, long-buried secrets coming to light, mysteries solved through impossible knowledge possessed by twin girls who spoke with the authority of prophets despite their tender age. Judge Harrison's final report on the Pine Hollow investigation filled 47 pages and documented crimes spanning more than 2 decades. His concluding paragraph would be quoted in legal texts for generations. This case challenges our fundamental assumptions about the nature of justice, truth, and the persistence of moral accountability beyond the grave. While science cannot explain the source of the Morrison children's knowledge, the accuracy of their testimony cannot be disputed. Perhaps some truths are indeed too important to remain buried forever. Pastor Phillips eventually established a new ministry in eastern Tennessee, where he spent the remainder of his career helping communities confront difficult truths and seek genuine redemption. He never forgot the 3 days in Pine Hollow when 2 9-year-old girls had torn apart 16 years of carefully constructed lies with knowledge that no living person should have possessed. The mystery of Rebecca and Rachel Morrison's abilities was never solved. Medical experts of the era had no framework for understanding their impossible knowledge, and religious authorities were divided on whether their gifts represented divine blessing or something far more complex. What remains undisputed is the historical record of their accuracy. Every detail they revealed about Pine Hollow's crimes proved correct. Every location they identified yielded the evidence they claimed would be found. Every secret they exposed was verified through independent investigation. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of their story is not what they revealed about the past, but what they suggested about the nature of justice itself. If the dead truly cannot rest while their murders remain hidden, if innocence possesses some power to transcend death and demand accountability, then perhaps our understanding of moral consequence extends far beyond the boundaries of earthly life. The Morrison twins vanished from historical records sometime in the 1842nd. Their fate as mysterious as their abilities. Some say they continued their father's ministry until their own deaths, serving as instruments of truth in communities across the American frontier. Others believe they eventually learned to suppress their terrible gift and lived quiet, normal lives far from the circuit churches where their reputation had been established. But in the remote corners of Appalachia, in settlements where old secrets still fester and ancient crimes remain unpunished, travelers sometimes report encountering twin sisters who possess knowledge no living person should have. They speak of the dead with casual familiarity, reveal truths that have been buried for generations, and remind the guilty that some forms of justice transcend the limitations of mortal law. Whether these encounters represent the same Morrison twins, their spiritual legacy, or something else, entirely remains a mystery that science cannot solve and faith cannot fully explain. What we know with certainty is that truth, like energy, can neither be created nor destroyed, only transformed from one state to another. And sometimes, just sometimes, it finds voices willing to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The files on the Pine Hollow investigation remain in the Kentucky State Archives, available to researchers who wish to verify the extraordinary claims made in this account. Judge Harrison's meticulous documentation, Sheriff Mackenzie's evidence reports, and Pastor Phillips's personal journals all corroborate the essential facts of this case. But the deeper mystery, the question of how two 9-year-old children could possess impossible knowledge and serve as voices for the dead, remains as unsolved today as it was in 1834. Some truths, it seems, are destined to remain beyond the reach of human understanding, dwelling in that shadowland between faith and reason, where the most profound mysteries of existence continue to elude our grasp. Do you believe the Morrison twins truly communicated with the spirits of murder victims? Do you think their knowledge could be explained through natural means we simply don't understand? The evidence supports their accuracy, but the source of their abilities remains one of history's most compelling, unsolved mysteries. What's your theory about the Morrison twins? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Are you brave enough to consider the possibility that death is not the end of consciousness? Or do you believe there's a rational explanation for their impossible knowledge? Don't forget to subscribe for more mysteries that challenge everything we think we know about reality, and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Until next time, remember that some secrets refuse to stay buried forever, and sometimes the most innocent voices carry the most devastating truths.